Hi, everybody. I'm going to review the Matt Dillahunty, Jonathan Sheffield debate today, and I'm going to do that in just a minute. So without further ado, let me turn it over to that. And before I get started, I wanted to mention, I just put it down in the chat. I took all moderation abilities away from everyone because I wanted to put everybody on equal playing field because I felt like I saw some people turning off other people, blocking other people, that sort of thing. And I found some people were blocked that I hadn't blocked myself. And had hidden from my YouTube channel, and I didn't want to have that happen. So I just took the abilities away from everyone to put everybody on an equal playing field. So I hope no one takes offense that you see that you no longer have a wrench, because nobody has a wrench anymore on my channel. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to this debate. So here we go. Okay, you can all see this. Let's get to the debate. So last night, this was playing. It was Jonathan Sheffield is a Christian and Matt Dillahunty is an atheist. And they debated on essentially on the reliability of the Gospels. And so I decided I was going to ask Matt Dillahunty a question that I had asked him 3 years ago on the atheism experience in a very embarrassing telephone call. So 3 years ago, I decided I was going to call Matt Dillahunty up and give him a piece of my mind. I had a chip on my shoulder and it came through in the call pretty badly. And what happened was I asked him, I said, why were the disciples so brave? And he said, I said, why did they come out of hiding? And he said, well, maybe they were hungry and they wanted to get a sandwich. And his friends laughed. And then he decided that I was wasting his time. And I made the big, huge mistake of saying, of course, I'm wasting his time. I don't know why that came out of my mouth, but it did. And so the video has gone viral. Over 500,000 people have watched it. And so to redeem myself last night, I decided I was going to ask Matt Dillahunty in a super chat a similar question. And so I'm going to start with that. And then I'm going to go back to the beginning of the debate. And at the beginning of the debate, then we'll talk about what this was covering. But this question is very important and relevant to the Gospels, because if the Gospel authors, which included two of Jesus's apostles, Matthew and John, if the Gospel authors were crafting their piece, you have to show me that they had motivation to make anything up. And I'm just saying that they didn't have any motivation. The disciples in early history of Christianity had no legal protections, and many of them were beaten and stoned. And so that's essentially what I asked Matt here. And so let's listen to his explanation if he gives a best explanation for what they did.
Into the next one, we have S.J. Thomason. Appreciate your super chat. S.J. asks, James, Paul, and Peter denied or persecuted Jesus. Then they saw the risen Christ. They preached for decades, in all caps. Despite being jailed, beaten, etc., they were stoned, beheaded, and crucified. What motivations did they have? I think this is for Matt, though it's maybe not directly related to the topic.
It's not remotely relevant to this.
Of course, it's relevant to the topic. Now, this is one of the things that Matt is going to try to do to skip away from answering the question. He's going to say it has nothing to do with the topic. Now, look at the topic. Did the disciples author the Gospels? Matt, in this whole debate, is making the bald assertion that somebody else authored the Gospels. And what Jonathan Sheffield has brilliantly done is he laid out all of the ancient support for the Gospels attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, Matthew was the tax collector. Mark was the friend of Peter, which actually Mr. Dillahunty did admit. Luke is a doctor. Luke was actually unrelated, except for the thing that Jonathan Sheffield didn't point out when Matt Dillahunty started talking about Luke. One thing to point out with Luke is Luke traveled with Paul, and we have reference of that because he started referring to himself in the first person starting in Acts 16. So Luke traveled with Paul. And then, of course, we have John, the beloved son of Zebedee, a disciple of Jesus. Now, we have internal evidence in Matthew that it's the tax collector. So let me just go into that really quickly. Matthew, there's 4 different tax collecting relating events in the book of Matthew. 2 are unique to the book of Matthew, just about tax collectors. And one of them also, Matthew probably had some money because according to Luke, he threw a great banquet for Jesus. But according to Matthew and Mark, it was just a dinner. It wasn't highlighted. So there's a couple of things like that. And then in the book of John, we have lots of evidence internally that this is authored by John, the beloved disciple, because number one, this is the only gospel where we have the story of John and Peter running to the empty grave. The other books just mentioned Peter running to the empty graves. This one says John ran to the empty grave, and that John outran Peter. We also have in the book of John a reference, again, he keeps calling himself the beloved disciple, but we know that he puts himself in that position as the one sitting next to Jesus at the Last Supper, the beloved disciple. And so we also have the fact that John was actually at the foot of Jesus during the crucifixion. Now, that's not cited in any of the other Gospels. And we also know that John was at the trial of Jesus, and he was given permission to be in there. And that was also only cited in the book of John. So we have plenty of internal evidence to support the Gospels. But let's go on to see how Matt comes up with an answer to my question of why Peter, who denied Jesus 3 times, why Paul, who started persecuting Christians and all of a sudden had this experience on the road to Damascus and came to believe in Jesus' divinity, and James, Jesus' half-brother, who at one point tried to stop his ministry, but suddenly came out and preached for Jesus for decades. And he ended up being martyred in Jerusalem, which was documented by Josephus. Josephus was not a Christian. He was a hostile witness to Christianity. We know that he cited that James was Jesus' half-brother. And so we have that evidence. So here we go.
Subject to this debate, and I think Jonathan would agree as well. What motivations would somebody have to say something? I'm not denying the fact that authors of various things are sincerely convinced that they are telling the truth.
So if people are sincerely convinced they're telling the truth, and if they are willing to go to their death, their graves, if they're put in jail, they're prisoned, they're stoned over a period of decades, and they said it's because Jesus rose from the dead, you need to tell me what other explanation you have, Mr. Dillahunty, for this event.
That's secondary to whether or not they are in fact being accurate. Just like when people tell me they're abducted by aliens, I'm willing to believe that they are honestly conveying what they experienced. And
see, this isn't even related, people being abducted by aliens. Again, Mr. Dillahunty needs to give us the answer, the best explanation for why they acted as they did. He's saying so far that yes, they believed what they saw, but he's not continuing to give us a true answer.
In whatever language and limitations they can, but that doesn't mean they were actually abducted by aliens. And if somebody tells me that so-and-so wrote this book and I have no evidence other than hearsay, generally speaking, I'm not going to be bothered. Like, this comes up with, well, how do you know that, Socrates wrote what Socrates wrote, or Plato wrote what Plato wrote? How do you know there wasn't some crossover? How do you know that one of them wasn't fictional? I don't know, and I don't care, because what matters there is not the author, it's the substance of what's in there. And it's why just the other day somebody asked me, hey, who are you debating on Friday? And for whatever reason, Jonathan's name wasn't coming to mind. I had a lot of stuff going on. And I said, I don't know and I don't care, because the person I'm debating isn't relevant. What's relevant is the actual subject. And so if the subject is, did the disciples author the canonical Gospels? And you're expecting one person to come down as yes and one person to come down as no. What you've got is somebody coming down with yes and somebody coming down with, I don't understand and cannot accept how you can say yes. It's just the evidence to meet this burden of proof hasn't been met. So I don't know how SJ's question, but I guess that's not unusual.
So yes, it's not unusual that Matt doesn't have an answer to my question. Now he's saying that the Gospels are hearsay. We have early attributions from everybody, all these ancient sources that Jonathan's about to cite. I'm going to go play his initial opening, and I'm also going to play Matt Dillahunty's opening. But we have support that everybody basically said it's attributable to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There's nobody making it attributable to anybody else. Nobody's saying it's attributable to Cephas or anything else. Now, another thing that Matt brings up in this particular debate is he talks a lot about other Gnostic Gospels that were not canonized. And one of the reasons is because they were not handed down. They weren't coming from the eyewitnesses. And so that's one of the reasons they were canonized. And I'm looking at the chat. I just want to say nobody is, I don't have any mods anymore, guys. I just got rid of all of my mods because I didn't want to, I saw some infighting going on, and I had people telling me that they were really uncomfortable being in my chat. And then I found people who were suddenly had been blocked by other people, and I didn't block them myself. So I just decided to put everybody on an equal playing field. So I'm sorry if you don't see a wrench when you once had one. It's not that I took yours away just in purpose. I took everybody's away. So I didn't pick on anybody. I wanted everybody to be equal. All right, so here we go. Let's go to the beginning here and listen to this opening.
The New Testament textual documents that Augustine cited against him were not written by an apostle, but by some pretender under his name, and therefore carried no weight. By way of rejoinder, Augustine tests Faustus' allegation by walking through the legal framework used to identify and authenticate documents in the ancient world. Augustine sets up his argument by asking the following question. How do we know the authorship of the works of Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Varro, and other similar writers, but by the unbroken chain of evidence? How is the authorship ascertained in each case, except by the author's having brought his work into public notice as much as possible in his own lifetime, and by the transmission of the information from one to another in continuous order, the belief becoming more certain as it becomes more general up to our own day? Take the books now before us. Should anyone after some years deny that this book was written by me, or that Faustus was written by him, where is evidence for the fact to be found, but in the information possessed by some at the present time, and transmitted by them through successive generations, even to distant times? In other words, Augustine explains how information can be traced to its root source through time by 1, finding general references to the circulation of the author's publication, and 2, tracking to whom these references point back to. Ultimately, Augustine is providing testable and measurable criteria by which we can historically conclude the identification of an author. Very tellingly, the procedure implemented by Augustine are still commonly used in modern courts of law and historiographic studies for the identification and authentication of documents. If we were to apply Augustine's criterion to the classical work On the Nature of Things, a didactic poem widely attributed to Lucretius, we see the procedure is logically sound and leads to a credible answer. Applying the first element, we ask, is there any empirical documentation from those present at the time asserting that Lucretius is a true author and source of On the Nature of Things? The answer is a conclusive yes. In a letter by Cicero to his brother Quintus in 54 BC, Cicero states, "The poems of Lucretius are as you write. They exhibit many flashes of genius and show great mastership." In addition, Virgil, another Roman author, refers to passages of Lucretius' work in his second book, the Georgics. Second, was this information transmitted through successive generations and even to distant times? Again, the procedure leads to an affirmative answer time and time again. Specifically, a number of historical figures either quote from Lucretius' poem or express great admiration for his work. The list includes Quintilius, a Roman educator around the mid-1st century, Tacitus, the prosecutor for Domitian, and Marcus Cornelius, a 2nd century Roman grammarian. Because Lucretius was critical of religion, his poem was disparaged and commented on by most early church fathers from the 3rd through the 8th century, including Lactanicus, Jerome, Isidore of Seville, and Bede. While the sole surviving manuscript of On the Nature of Things was only rediscovered in 1417, does a review of the documentary evidence point to any other author other than Lucretius? If not, the only natural conclusion is that Lucretius is the author of this title. The same procedural precedent can also be used for the Aeneid, and it will show no other guilty party can be identified other than Virgil as the author of the Aeneid. For the celebrity of Virgil's work in the Roman world was immediate and lasting. The Aeneid enjoyed the rare distinction of being hailed as a canonical poem while it was still being written. Of the Aeneid, Virgil's friend and fellow poet Prosperus wrote, "Something greater than the Iliad is being born." The Aeneid was also lectured on in the schools by Cassius Esperata, a freedman of Cicero's friend Atticus, and an acquaintance of Cornelius Gallus. Even the historian Dr. Carrier affirms that the Aeneid was written in a period of history that is exceptionally well documented, compared to the circumstances in which the Tao-Chuan and Homeric epics were composed. This allows us to understand in good detail the context of the Aeneid's formation. From all this, it necessarily follows that we should also be able to apply the same procedure and provide ancient documentation to trace when and where the 4 Gospels of the Apostolic Churches were written and by who. In fact, During the late 2nd century, Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Gaius were able to name some of the authors and provide details for the formation of the so-called Gnostic text using this precedent. After Augustine explains his methodology, he challenges the Manichaeans by asking, other than those who have been swayed by the rhetoric assailing the gospel records, who would be so blind to passion as to deny the ability of the churches of the apostles to transmit their writings to posterity? Otherwise, how do we explain that almost all the independent Greek, Latin, Aramaic, and Coptic apostolic churches come up with the same 4 books, naming the same authors of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John?
This itself is critical to understanding what's going on here, because we've got no ancient sources supporting this idea of anonymity. And so to claim anonymity is actually a faith position.
Unless it does go back to the disciples of Jesus, as Irenaeus, Tertullian, Eusebius, and the apostolic churches said it did. Therefore, the selfsame investigative principles that led to the identification of Virgil and Lucretius as authors of their respective works will provide the threads of evidence pointing us back to the disciples of Jesus as the authors guilty of writing the 4 Gospels. Our first lead in building our case comes from Papias, the bishop of Hierapolis. He provides a statement of record identifying Matthew and Mark as authors of their respective Gospels. He identifies his source as John the Apostle, a figure who Irenaeus corroborates but Papias knew. This evidence is remarkable. It supports the authors bringing their work into the public eye and now classifies the disciples of Jesus as persons of interest in our investigation. The next step is to pull on this thread and see where it leads us. Contemporary evidence is also made available through gospel excerpts found in the letters of Bishop Polycarp, Ignatius, Clement, and the Apostle Paul. When we examine these texts, we're pointed once again in the direction of Jesus' disciples. For the common thread that binds these ancients is their personal associations with the apostles.
Okay, so let's notice how many people he's named so far. So he's got, I'm just writing them down here. He says Irenaeus, Tertullian, Gaius, Eusebius, Papias, and Papias is collaborated by Irenaeus. And we have Polycarp, Ignatius, Clement, and of course, St. Paul. And St. Paul is obviously a very early attestation. And so we've got a lot of ancient sources pointing to the 4 gospel authors, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, so for Matt to come up with an alternative to this, it's going to have to give us some alternative ancient sources saying that the gospels were attributed to anyone else. Of course, he does not have any of that. And so what he's going to do is a different approach. So we'll get to that in just a sec.
And or their appointments to the office of bishops in the churches of the apostles in which the writings are found. The thread then takes us to Bishop Irenaeus around 180 AD. Irenaeus was a student of Polycarp at the Church of Smyrna, whose letter to Florinius recounts Polycarp's intercourses with John and with the rest of those who had seen the Lord, and how he would call their words to remembrance. Irenaeus' statement that Polycarp received information from the eyewitnesses, along with his identification of the gospel authors by names, begins to paint the disciples of Jesus as likely suspects in our investigation. But let's keep following this thread. Evidence further supporting these suspects are corroborated in the Muratorian canon around 170 AD, Tertullian's work against Marcion in 190 AD, Tatian's Diatessaron in 160 AD, and Clement of Alexandria around 180 AD. Common history from Asia Minor, Rome, North Africa, Alexandria, and Assyria all point back towards the disciples of Jesus. The evidence is consistent with Tertullian's and Irenaeus' statement that the independent objective framework of the apostolic churches provide evidence which all basically identify Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as the respective authors of the Gospels. Irenaeus and Tertullian affirm that this is founded on the principle that the churches can enumerate those who were established by the apostles as bishops in the churches, and their successors then serve as guardians meant to preserve these apostolic works. This establishes the transfer, control, and mechanism that links these writings to the apostles. which Augustine cites against Faustus when he refers to the unbroken chain of evidence.
Let me first say, I've noted, I'm looking at the chat right now, and I want to make sure nobody feels like, all of you have been extremely kind to me. You've been very good. I just took mods away from everybody though, because I was having, there was a fight going on a little bit yesterday between a couple of mods, and I had some really negative feedback on that from some Christians. And so I thought, well, if I just take everyone's mods away, then I won't have people blocking or deleting other people's messages or doing things like that. And I tend to have that because I did find some people who were blocked, and I know the people who are in here, I don't think any of you are doing that kind of stuff. So it's not you, believe me. I just took everybody's mods away for now. Maybe I'll add mods back in at some point, but I just took them away for now because I didn't want to. I didn't want people deleting other people's messages. Essentially, I figured I can delete the messages if I see them and they're really bad. So, but usually people are pretty good about this kind of thing. You guys, people are really pretty amazing here. John Lloyd, especially Favor, you're a great person. I've seen you on Twitter too, and all of you are great. So, so thank you so much. So here we go. I'm just going to go back to this. Now let's notice, I'm just going to recap a little bit on what he said, just so you guys know. Look at all the people he's mentioned so far. So he's mentioned Irenaeus, Tertullian, Gaius, Eusebius, Papias, Polycarp, the Muratonian, and he's also mentioned geographical issues. So he's mentioned a number of different churches spread out all over the ancient Near East. So we've got lots and lots of support here. So let's keep going.
In his own argument. This again leads us back to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as the guilty party, since no exculpatory evidence can be provided in favor of the contrary. While I'll assume that Mr. Dillahunty may dispute some of this evidence, I'd like to emphasize that the statistical probability of the accumulated documentation being incorrect is almost zero. Augustine conveys a key point with the Manichaeans, that if we reject the overwhelming evidence in support of these gospel authors, then the absolute abolishment of all literature will follow. He states that there will be an end to all books handed down from the past if what is supported and established by the uniform testimony of so many men and so many times is brought into such suspicion that it is not allowed to have the credit and authority of common history. Throughout the ages, this concrete history remained the same as corroborated in the writings of Origen, Athanasius.
So now he's even named a couple of more, but I want to say, I'm looking at the chat. Hi, everybody. I love seeing all of you guys. As I said before, don't worry. I just took the mods away. I still appreciate every one of you. And I know, see, the thing, Cameron, is Brian actually took that into this debate right here. If you look at the chat on this debate, you're going to see that Brian was going after me pretty much the whole night. Not pretty much the whole night. I mean, the part of the night that I was actually active in the chat. And so I just thought, this is just crazy. So I just demodded everybody. And so, but I know it doesn't sound like, I mean, it's coming from somebody else. And I know Brian usually is here. He's not here right now, so I'm not going to say any more about him, but he, yeah. So anyway, so that was going on. So I'll just assume free speech and let you guys all keep talking. So
Eusebius, Jerome, Augustine, and others. This led up until the 18th century, when the worldview of the Enlightenment was cultivated under the scholarship of people like Semler, Storr, Griesbach, Fraser, Bauer, Strauss, and even Maximil Robespierre. And with that, I conclude my opening statements and turn it over to Mr. Dillahunty.
So I would say it was a pretty good deal, what was going on with Jonathan. Jonathan, again, just to support what he said, he's pointed out a whole bunch of ancient sources who've cited Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So for Matt to get away from this, Matt is actually going to try to throw in a few toxic bombs to try to get away from this. So let's see what he says.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Over to you, Matt. Thanks so much for being here as well.
I had politely muted my microphone during that. Now I'm unmuted. Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate being here, and thanks to Jonathan for agreeing to do this. This is a curious debate, and I appreciate almost being referred to as a doctor, but I'm not. I'm not a New Testament scholar. I'm not a linguist. I'm not a historian. And honestly, it doesn't matter to me whether or not the Gospels were written by a disciple or an eyewitness. As a skeptic, I understand that eyewitness testimony is unreliable. I understand that memory is faulty. I understand that stories grow in the retelling. And I also know that trying to remember a conversation from last week or even 5 minutes ago is difficult enough. let alone trying to chronicle a speech that you heard decades ago.
Okay, so he's making an assertion here about memory, and he's right about a few things. I want to point out a couple of things with people's memory. Number one, in the ancient Near East, in that time, most people were illiterate. You got about 90%, according to Bart Ehrman, even, of the population who were illiterate during that time. They couldn't read or write. So what they did was they really cherished what they called oral traditions. So they passed down a lot of information, and they cherished the idea of memorizing. And it's not something that we're used to today. We're not people who memorize even the whole Bible. There were people, though, in the past who did that kind of thing. They took a lot of pride in memorizing things and passing down oral traditions and retaining the information in an accurate way. So we don't see this whole idea of the phone game that Bart Ehrman said. Now, another thing about Bart Ehrman is Bart Ehrman's second edition of Misquoting Jesus basically said the core tenets of Christianity have been retained accurately in the text, no matter what he says with a telephone game. But the other thing I want to mention with memory is when you have a very, put it this way, if you have a memory that really stands out in your mind, like how many of you right now know where you were standing when JFK Jr.'s plane went down? I know exactly where I was. I was in the Bahamas, actually, on a boat when I heard about it. And so yeah, I was there. And I also know exactly where I was when the planes hit the World Trade Center. I heard it first on the air, on the radio. I heard of the World Trade Center event occurring while I was driving to work. Actually, it's about 9 o'clock in the morning, and I heard it from Howard Stern because I used to listen to his channel, believe it or not. So that's where I heard it. So you remember events that really stand out in your mind. Those tend to be well remembered, and you can only imagine the crucifixion event and the event of when they discovered the empty tomb on Sunday. So you've got a very deep memory that would be ingrained in your mind. And again, so you've got a tradition where they're passing things down orally that they cherish, and you have these events that in many cases were traumatic and then extremely joyous. So we remember that kind of stuff.
As an exercise without rewinding, you can go back and try to quote as much of what I've said so far in the last few seconds as you can. I'm a skeptic, and a proper application of skepticism would recognize these issues and many other issues and reach the conclusion that the authorship of the Gospels, even if verified, even if written by Jesus himself, would not add credibility to some of the claims that they make. I know that's difficult for people to hear and understand. We rely on and are often forced to make decisions based solely on a hearsay testimonial account. And the conclusion that we reach is based on a fuzzy estimation of how trustworthy we consider the source. We like to get things from the horse's mouth when we can. We prefer, hey, I saw this, rather than a friend of mine saw this, and even more than someone saw this. It's natural to do this, and as noted, sometimes it's all you have to go on to make a decision. But when it comes to the gospel authorship, we're not required to make a decision. And as far as I can tell, all attempts to push for this sort of decision are merely an attempt to claim authority, authenticity, accuracy, and authorship in order to prop up otherwise weak and unreasonable claims. I can hear someone out there thinking, how dare you question an actual disciple of Jesus or a gospel that was written by Jesus himself? The problem is that none of the Gospels are signed. We don't have originals, but none of them.
See, the Gospels don't need to be signed. It's one of the things that you have to remember is these authors, in many cases, were extremely humble people. We know that Luke actually said he took strides to make an orderly account, meaning a chronological account, to Theophilus, and he made that clear. He also noted that actually just to note this as far as the dating. So Matt in this debate is going to mention that Luke could have been written in the 50s. And one of the reasons he says that is, number one, it could be the fact that the Gospel of Luke comes before the Acts book, and he even says that in the first paragraph of the Acts book. But another thing is, in the Acts book, we have two people whose martyrdoms were not even mentioned, who are the main characters, Peter and Paul. And so we would assume that the book was written prior to their martyrdoms, and one of the martyrdoms they occurred somewhere around 62 or 64. And so we can say that that was written pretty early. And then we know that Matthew and Mark, people have indicated that they're written even before Luke. So this could be very early. But even before all of this stuff, even if we didn't even have the Gospels, we have enough extra biblical support for Jesus's death, crucifixion under Pontius Pilate, and even the claims, even from Josephus, that the disciples said they saw the risen Christ. And we have other ancient support for this kind of stuff outside of the Bible from hostile witnesses. So we have enough with that. But going back to this memorize idea, just think of 1 Corinthians 15. Even Bart Ehrman and all of these other skeptics, or if I would call them suppressors, have indicated that 1 Corinthians 15 is within just a few years of Jesus' resurrection. And that's the memorized creed that basically says that Jesus appeared to these people. First, he appeared to Peter, then he appeared to the 12, then he appeared to 500, then he appeared to James, Jesus' half-brother. Now, if you're Catholic and you think that James is actually the same as the other James that's mentioned as a disciple, just please note that it's separated. We had two apostles named James. One's the brother of John, and the other one is the son of Alphaeus. And then we have, and the 12 were mentioned specifically in 1 Corinthians 15. And then comes this other James, who's Jesus's half-brother. Okay, so that is a pretty specific thing to think about.
Them claim to be written by the individual whose name is attached to them. None of them claim to be eyewitnesses. The closest we get is the Gospel of John's suggestion. Sorry, I restricted number calling me. This is the Gospel of John's suggestion that this gospel is based on the writings of the beloved disciple, the disciple Jesus loves. But that person isn't identified or referenced with that term outside of the book of John. People have suggested it was John of Zebedee, maybe. That seems kind of likely. Some others have suggested it was Lazarus and even Mary Magdalene, but the book doesn't say this book was written by the disciple that Jesus loves. It just says that it is.
And so just go back if you haven't heard this at the very beginning of this particular video, because I have mentioned a lot of internal support for this being the beloved disciple, John, the son of Zebedee. So there's a lot of internal support for that in the stories that he uniquely presents in the gospel, according to him.
Based on the testimony of what was written by the disciple, the beloved disciple. Of the four, only Matthew and John are even ever proposed as being written by disciples. Mark is claimed by the translator Peter, and Luke is the associate of Paul. The books are written in Greek, decades later after the events, seemingly from Greece, and Jesus and his disciples would have spoken Aramaic, and the events.
Now, we also know that Jesus and his disciples were given the abilities to speak multiple languages. So it's completely, we were told that in the book of Acts, that they were able to suddenly speak multiple languages, and they surprised a lot of the people around by being able to speak in other people's native tongues. And so it's completely legitimate to say that maybe they wrote it in Greek, but we also have Aramaic copies in ancient history. So we've got both Greek and Aramaic. And we also have variations of the quality of the Greek in the book of Mark. So if you go to the Gospel of Mark, if you can read Greek, which I can't, so I actually heard this from somebody else, somebody who studies this stuff, and this is their main field. This person said basically there are variations in the quality of the Greek translations in the book of Mark, and it's because the information that Mark was recording was passed down to him from other people, and his native tongue was probably Aramaic. And so when he would put out certain portions of the Gospels, the quality varied. So that's something I heard.
In Galilee. Why put Mark's name on a gospel? Like if you were going to fake something, why would you put Mark's name on the gospel?
Exactly. Why wouldn't it be the gospel according to Peter if we're going to fake something? So he's actually selling our point.
Instead of Peter, because if Mark is the translator for Peter, wouldn't it make more sense just to call it Peter's gospel? This is a common argument that I've heard for authenticity. And yes, that'd be very cool. Unfortunately, in the early days of Christian writings, there's also a Gospel of Peter written perhaps within a decade.
No. I actually looked that up to see exactly when the Gospel of Peter was written, and the Gospel of Peter was written in the end of the 6th century. So Matt is just pulling something out of his sock or something. I don't know where he's coming up with this really early thing, because if you look it up yourself, you're going to find that the Gospel of Peter was discovered in the 1800s and it was written at the late 6th century. So this information from Matt is baloney. In fact, all of the other ancient documents that weren't canonized, in many cases, they were written hundreds of years after the event, and so they weren't considered legitimate. And the other thing is, when you look at these Gnostic information, you can see that that's when legends started to grow. They started to have these huge gigantic people, the scene around the crucifixion, everything was a lot different in those particular gospels. So those were just phony, and that's one of the reasons why the church fathers didn't accept them.
Or so of the Gospel of Mark. Dating is a big problem, but maybe somebody decided it would be too risky to claim that Peter wrote something. After all, we're talking about a fisherman who spoke Aramaic, somehow writing in Greek many years later. Or perhaps the disciple who betrayed didn't really make for the best reference at a particular time. Or one of many other countless reasons, including the notion that this was written by Mark, who wasn't a disciple, may actually add some credibility. Oh, I didn't hear it from this disciple. I heard it from the guy who followed him around and chronicled all his stuff. Who knows? But you only have to do a little research to find the truth. None of the Gospels are signed. None of them make any claim to be an eyewitness or a disciple. So
That's actually completely untrue. So we've got, not only do we have Luke traveling, starting in Acts 16, traveling personally and referring to himself in the first person in the book of Acts, which originally was combined with Luke. So it's Luke, Acts. The two went together. He wrote one, then he wrote the other one. And so that could be even considered a gospel in some format. But in the book of Acts, we see that firsthand experience. And we also have other information going on. So we've got in Mark, for example, we know from the later epistles that Mark is John Mark, and he was an associate of Peter. He also knew Peter. Luke knew Paul. Luke went closely with Paul. Paul knew Peter and James. So they all met up. These people knew each other. They were all eyewitnesses and considered legitimate. And that's why the church fathers chose them and their books in the canon.
The books aren't claiming to be written by disciples or eyewitnesses. What's the justification for attempting to claim that they are? Why didn't God, for example, instruct people to sign those books? Why not do what forgers of some of Paul's letters?
I'll tell you what Paul specifically says in one of his books is he specifically says the words in the books came to him from God. So Paul says that these words weren't his own words, words came to him from God. Now, some people can deny that, they can think that God doesn't exist. I personally have heard the voice of God one time in my life. And so, yes, it's completely possible that they're God-breathed words.
Did and claimed to be Paul, perhaps because there were known forgeries around this time. And if a book makes a claim about its authorship and there's no way to verify it, that's a problem. But if you don't claim authorship, if you don't claim a signatory, then there's no risk of reprisal. Maybe it's because we're being a bit anachronistic. I mean, after all, we're sitting here in 2020. We have a canonized Bible that we can open up.
Okay, that's very funny, SD4R. It's like, why not pray to improve my viewer stats? I don't think God, that's not the kind of prayer I think that God is really going to warrant. He's going to be like, why are you praying to me over something so silly? I mean, I'm not going to waste God's time on such a silly prayer. I think it would be insulting to him to get such a silly prayer from me.
By the way, if you have a New International Version, you can open yours up and there'll be a cover page in front of the book of Matthew, and it will talk about the authorship. And right there in that Bible, it will say, we do not know who the author of Matthew is. It is church tradition that Matthew is the author of this, or that this has been attributed to Matthew. But modern audiences just see a package of books and consider it a book or a divinely inspired collection of books. They see the names attributed by the church in antiquity and just assume that these individuals who could not have investigated the authorship of these documents somehow got it right. So for clarity, my position is not these four gospels were definitely not written by disciples. My position is these four gospels don't ever claim to be written by disciples or eyewitnesses. They're not signed. The names attributed to them are matter of church tradition.
So he's going against the early attributions from all of these church fathers. So Jonathan cited many church fathers who attributed the gospels to the four authors. Matt is saying because the gospels themselves didn't. But if you go and look internally in the gospels, you can see internal support for the four authors as they say they are.
One can ever do is suggest that this was either God guiding people to pick the right books for the canon, or these church leaders made their best guess and had some good reason and other information that we don't have. Imagine a collection of early Christian writings. As a matter of fact, you can go to earlychristianwritings.com and see an incredibly lengthy list along with approximate dates and links to scholarly articles about who potentially wrote them and when and why. And there's countless debates about this. You can see all of that, and it's a good reference. I have no idea if that reference is sourced by a Christian or a non-Christian, but it's there. There are disagreements about dating methods, disagreements about which linguistic traits best align with which potential authors, even when we have no other writings by the proposed authors. There's suggestions of multiple authorship and edits. In the end, we just don't know. If there were 15 unsigned letters about Elvis's life, letters that never claimed to be eyewitness accounts and never identified the author as someone in Elvis's presence, and they disagreed on facts, how do you decide which four are most accurate and who wrote them? Does it make sense to attribute a letter to a member of his band and another one to Colonel Parker? That's only in the near past.
The funny thing here, the irony here is Matt is initially he's going and saying that we don't know who these authors are. And then later on in this debate, he's basically going to say only content matters. It doesn't matter who authors anything. It's the content of what they say. Now, I could say the same thing. I don't really care who authored the four gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I do know that the church fathers considered them credible. I do know that they took great lengths to make sure that they had true information in their books. And I do know they probably prayed to God over which books should be canonized. I'm sure they did a lot of that. I mean, I can can think of my own church and the strains that they took to find a new pastor. Our senior pastor left. He felt called to go to a different church up in Mississippi. It took them like 10 months to find another pastor. They had to have a council put together. They're all deep in prayer all the time, trying to figure out which person should do it. And it kind of reminds me of even in the early church, when they wanted to pick out another apostle to be in the 12, they basically, prayed to God. They wanted to make sure that they picked the right person. And they ended up going with Matthias, I believe, because that's how they felt that God had answered their prayers. People, they really wanted to get the information true. If you feel like you're going to be held accountable to God for the information you put together, you're going to do everything you can to make sure it's correct. You don't want to give incorrect information.
The near past that we're talking about. So what's the deal with anonymity? If God had wanted the authors clearly identified, why weren't they? I fully expect someday an apologist will just acknowledge that we don't know who wrote them to any reasonable degree of confidence. And this is fine, because even Jesus's autobiography.
Mind Onion, thank you. I just see that you're saying that Bart Ehrman says that the book of Peter was written earlier than I said. So I'm going to have to go and find where I found that. It's in one of the books that I have downstairs, but I don't know which, I don't recall which I saw. I had looked it up. It's one of my books downstairs because I was flipping through them, and I think it's in this. Okay, so I will get that reference. I think it's in the. Went through two specific books. One of them is Evidence That Demands a Verdict, and the other one was I forget what it's. But anyway, it's downstairs. So I will find that information and get that to you. Sorry about that. If I am wrong, I stand corrected.
Be enough to convince a skeptic. God knew this and didn't bother, and that's the trend. So there's no claim to eyewitness. They don't read like eyewitnesses. They're more of a narrative. There's none that identify the author. At most, it's an according to, which suggests a second or third hand account. The dating is a potential problem. By the way, I don't know how much time I have left, but I'm gonna skip to the most important bits. It makes sense that as battles occurred between different Christian sects from the beginning of the 2nd century through the mid 4th century, the doctrinal wars, and there's still no canon at this point. There's loose suggestions about a canon. And so you have competing ideologies. So
he's got a point that you guys might want to consider here when you're thinking about the early church. The earliest people who preached Christianity and who traveled around sharing the good news with everybody, these early people didn't have this Bible as we have it put together. They basically, Paul was writing letters to the church occasionally. We had the gospel authors putting that stuff together all pretty early, but they didn't have that kind of stuff, and they still believed Jesus, but they did have that creed. Okay, they had that creed almost within a couple of years of when Jesus was resurrected. So the creed is what's so important. The 1 Corinthians 15, they memorized that, and that's really all they had to go on. So imagine ourselves in that same position. If that's all we had to go on, we have enough. And then plus you've got a bunch of hostile people to Christianity who also reported supporting evidence corroborating the gospel. So we've got that. So Mind Onion, look around some source. I got a book downstairs. I've got 2 thick books downstairs, and I was flipping through. Anyway, so here we go.
How do you show that your preferred text, your preferred canon, shared by many, is more accurate and foundational? Why? You can just claim that yours has a direct tie to one of the disciples. And when we look at all of this, we find that for the most part, it seems to all tie back to Irenaeus. Irenaeus was the first to cite John as the author, referencing others as well. But why? Why 4, let alone these 4? Well, here's a quote from Irenaeus. It is not possible that the Gospels can either be more or fewer in number than they are, for since there are 4 quarters of the earth in which we live. I know you're...
Okay, I want to go to John V. John says the book was written at the end of the 6th century, but the text itself dates back to the second half of the 2nd century. So like around between 150 maybe and 200, you're saying the text, that's still pretty late. That's not at all what the earlier ones are from. So that's likely why, even if it's that late, that's well after the lifetimes of the people who were present during Jesus' time. So now what Matt's going to do right here is he's going to throw in a little nugget about flat Earth. Here we go.
You're having a flat Earth debate soon, so maybe references first.
So he's saying that Irenaeus is apparently a fan of numerology in some way, because he's using this idea of the 4 corners of the earth. But also, even if we were just to think about 4 authors, he's saying, why are there 4 authors? And Matt's kind of making fun of the fact that he is looking at numerology a little bit. But numbers are extremely important in the Gospels. In fact, the number 40 represents a lot. When we had in the Exodus, they were traveling around for 40 years. Moses went up for 40 days into the mountain. Then you have the references with Jesus, when as soon as he was baptized, he fasted for 40 days. And so there are certain numbers that were important. And the number 4, if you go with Irenaeus's thoughts, which is kind of interesting, think of north, south, east, and west being like 4 corners, if you will, on a map or something. So here we go.
Universal wins, while the church is scattered throughout all the world, and the pillars of the ground, and the church and the gospel and the spirit of life, it is fitting that she should have 4 pillars breathing out immortality on every side and vivifying men afresh. Therefore, the gospel is in accordance with these things. For the living creatures are quadriform, and the gospel is quadriform. These things being so, all who destroy the form of the gospel are vain, unlearned. This is an attack. This is just a bald-ass assertion that, hey, the gospels, there need to be 4 and exactly 4, and it goes on to these are the 4, and anybody saying otherwise is problematic. Remember, a century is quite a long time. To say that there's a bunch of people within a century or so who all agree on authorship doesn't tell you why they agree on authorship. If they agree because Irenaeus said so, then you have exactly one source. There are church fathers doing this, not unbiased historians, not expert researchers, not time travelers. They can only either tell you what they think or what they've heard. It's not like they lay out an evidence-based claim for authorship. It's, oh, I have it on authority from someone. How do you demonstrate that? And modern people are trying to lay out a claim for authorship and citing church fathers because the books themselves are unsigned, unclaimed, unverified, in disagreement, not written.
Even if we only had what Paul wrote, we have enough. Okay, so we have enough. Even if we only had the book of John, one gospel. Okay, so we know the synoptics are all 3 related to each other. There are a lot of duplicate passages in those books that are repeated several times, but we also know that John is unique. And so this is really, we could say 2 sources, even if we only had 2 sources of those 2 of those books, maybe Luke and John or something like that. So, or even if we had Paul, we have 1 Corinthians 15, even if we only had that creed, we have enough. Okay, so we've got a lot of support, even with, we have a lot of support beyond all we would need.
As eyewitnesses, not claim to be eyewitnesses. There's a motivation to give these 4 books selected by church authority and named by church tradition the air of authority because they on their own lack that credibility. Read a gospel that made the cut and one that didn't, and please tell me how to find out which is true and who wrote which one. I have no way to tell. And so I cannot reasonably conclude that they were written by disciples, especially giving the motivation for people to claim authority when it can't be demonstrated.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about, just for a second here, I'm going to mention something with the book of Matthew that I think is pretty interesting. So in the book of Matthew, now you recall that Matthew is referred to as Matthew in the book of Matthew, but in the other gospels, he's referred to as Levi. And Levi was a tax collector, and Jesus found him collecting taxes at his tax collecting station. Levi probably had some money because he did throw this great banquet, according to Luke. Now, of course, Matthew referred to himself as just having a dinner, sort of minor dinner. But also Matthew uniquely tells the story of this 2 drachma tax being paid by Jesus telling Matthew to go open up a fish's mouth and pull out this coin that was going to be paying his tax and Matthew's tax. And so it's unique because there's 4 different references to tax collecting in the book of Matthew, and 2 of them are completely unique to the book of Matthew. And why do we even care about tax collecting and tax collectors? Well, Matthew certainly did, because that was his profession. And so just think about that kind of thing. I want to see what John's saying. If you agree the number 40 is symbolic, then it is more probable any occurrence of it isn't historical. Jesus probably didn't fast for 40 days or didn't appear for 40 days. No, I think, yeah, actually, that's true. That's another one. Jesus appeared over 40 days after he was resurrected. And so I would say, I don't think that that's symbolic as a means of, I think that they were, there are a lot of different things. Like the another thing that's kind of symbolic in a way, and it doesn't mean it rules it out. I don't see a reason why people would craft a story saying he did something for 40 days when he really didn't do it for 40 days. Because again, I think people were striving to tell the truth back then. If you fear God, you truly fear God, you're not going to want to be crafting your own little story and saying Jesus did something he didn't do. Imagine being the height of to get God's anger. You don't want to do that. And so these people clearly feared God, and they're trying to write as accurately as possible. And if he said it was 40 days, then it was 40 days. So, so let's see. Okay, here we go.
Thanks so much, Matt. Appreciate it. We will jump into the open conversation, folks. So, quick reminder, if you happen to have a question, fire it into the old live chat, and I will be putting those into the list for the Q&A at the end. Thanks again, Matt and Jonathan. The floor is all yours.
Jonathan, you're muted, by the way.
Let's see. I apologize.
I do want to point something out. Now, I think both of these guys did well. I for the first time, I've seen Matt in a lot of different debates, and I've seen him usually pull the same thing where he'll listen to somebody. I just watched him in a Lacono debate too, and I think that he hasn't done as well in the past in his other debates. And I think that this particular debate, he actually brought some fresh information, and he didn't reference people like Gregory S. Paul that he usually likes. It's his go-to reference. He didn't do the kind of approaches he'd done with Inspiring Philosophy, which are basically saying, I'm not convinced. In fact, I had predicted he was going to say, I'm not convinced, and he did not say, I'm not convinced. So I was wrong. So he took a pretty meaty approach this time by going into looking at some pretty halfway decent arguments against what I think was a rock solid case from Jonathan Sheffield. So he took a different angle that wasn't so bad. I have to give him credit for that.
I just want to make sure that background noise comes in to interrupt your opening statement. So
Yeah, no, it's fine.
okay.
Okay, question to the audience. Who has a more comfy chair, Matt or Jonathan? Let's see what you guys say.
I think you brought up a lot of fair points in your opening statement. I think for the sake of really going through some of those questions.
Yes, actually, John V., I do believe the resurrection of the saints did occur. I absolutely believe that. In fact, that was predicted to occur in the Old Testament. And so it did occur in the Old Testament. And it's unfortunate it's only reported in the book of Matthew, but I do know that there are other apologists, there are Christian apologists and people like Mike Licona who think that that's just a symbolic thing, but I actually think that's a literal event.
Let's start with the initial point that Jesus and his disciples didn't know Greek, which would go to ability, and it's a fair objection to say maybe they didn't have the ability to do so. And these documents, as Dr. Ehrman points out, are written in highly, educated Greek, and they didn't possess those skills to do so. I think.
See, I don't think the Gospels are attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, there is a good chance that we would think that Luke is a doctor. Luke certainly had writing abilities, and we don't know as much about Mark and Mark's writing abilities. We do know that Matthew was a tax collector, so it's highly likely Matthew had decent writing abilities and the ability to it's highly likely as a tax collector, as Jonathan's going to point out here. And then we know John. Maybe John used a scribe, and so what? It's still attributable to John. Just like you have people who have biographies or autobiographies who actually work with other people to help them write that or edit it. So we have that potential thing out there. Somebody could have dictated a story to a scribe, and the scribe might have written it down. And scribes were quite popular back then because, again, about 90% of the population were illiterate.
I think my initial response is, do we get that from the data in the text itself or from any other literary or archaeological evidence for the period? Because, when we look at the Gospels, we notice that repeated mention is made in the New Testament of conversations, but there's no mention of an interpreter needed during Jesus and Pilate's dialogue. Jesus has a conversation, with the Roman centurion in Capernaum.
Jesus' and Pilate's dialogue is actually quite interesting for a few reasons. One is Pilate, you want to look at what they call undesigned coincidences and put some of this kind of stuff together. But Pilate's wife, it's told in one of the Gospels that Pilate's wife had a dream that Jesus, that he was going to be wrongly treated, and it really bothered her. And so she told Pilate, she said, don't have anything to do with that man. He's innocent, something like that. And that was reported, I think, in the book of Matthew. And then what happens is in other books, Pilate did whatever he could do to get away from having to execute Jesus, even saying that, offering Barabbas up and doing things like that. He did not want to have to execute Jesus. And he said, finally, he just washed his hands of it because the Jewish people kept demanding that he have Jesus executed. And so we can see why now. They really valued dreams in ancient times, and they valued them for a lot of the meaning that God might be sending to somebody through a dream. And you can, of course, remember some of the dreams that were through the Old Testament, like Nebuchadnezzar's dreams, and that Daniel interpreted. And we have that kind of thing going on a lot in the Old Testament. So the power of the dream shouldn't be undervalued. So wait, I see somebody else asking, don't you think it's more likely that the resurrection of the saints is not historical, given it wasn't attested in any other source? No, I just think I'd say that's an argument from silence. I think it occurred. And I think it occurred because that was supposed to occur. Basically, people were what they called trapped for their sins. There was only one event. I don't know if you know this, but there's only one event in the Old Testament that speaks of a relationship between this world and the other world. And it's when Samuel comes back, when somebody summons Samuel and Samuel comes back and says, why did you call me from, this other world? They basically were sort of trapped there. And that's the whole idea of Jesus and what he did. When he died, he went down for the 3 days. And guess what Mormons know? He did not travel to America over that 3-day period. He didn't do that. I'm sorry if you're Mormon and you're in the chat. But he died. He went down into the other world. It's very symbolic. It's 3 days and 3 nights is the same idiom that was repeated in the book of Jonah, where Jonah went into the belly of the whale. That's sort of like the other world, and the same kind of idea. Jesus went down, rescued the saints, brought the saints back up. And so then we see that kind of thing occurring. So no, I don't think that just because Matthew wrote it, now there's a chance we could find it elsewhere someday. Maybe it's written somewhere that we haven't found. Maybe there's some documents that we'll recover at some point that will support that. But yeah, right now it's less than ideal that we only have one source to say that.
Jesus talked with the Syro-Phoenician woman of who had said that she was especially Greek. And when we look through history and we see Josephus' writing, he often mentions the need of translation during miscellaneous conversations. And when we look at someone like Philo of Alexandria, he actually gives a detailed account of a journey he made to Rome with an Alexandrian Jewish legation to meet with Gaius Caligula at that time. And even though both meetings are described in full, not a word is said about the language they spoke with the emperor, because naturally this was assumed Philo would think that Greek was spoken.
I'm actually going to pull ahead from this and go towards the end of the conversation where they get to the Q&A, because I think it starts getting a little bit technical through this debate. And I think the Q&A brought up some interesting questions. Of course, I like my own question, but I'm going to go to some other questions because I feel like that some of the answers need to come out that might better answer some of these. Let me go back over to the Q&A. My question was right around an hour and 30 minutes, and Matt's answer to that, but let's go to the other ones.
Directly related to the topic.
It's not remotely relevant to the subject of this debate, and I think Jonathan would agree as well.
Okay, so my question was, and if you just joined now, I asked him, I paid $20 to ask this question because I haven't had an answer since 3 years ago when I called in the atheist experience and embarrassed myself. So I asked him why the disciples were so brave. My whole idea is basically saying, why would anyone make up a story if they know it's not true? And he admitted that they sincerely believed what they believed. And so the idea that they sincerely believed that they saw the risen Christ, and then they worshiped him over decades and risked being stoned, crucified, persecuted, all kinds of things, tells me that what they believed is the truth. They were in the unique position to know whether or not their beliefs are true. So that was his answer. It wasn't a very good answer that he gave, but let's go to the next question.
Dear, I think maybe Matt would agree with that too.
Yeah, no, I think it's a legitimate good question about something other than the subject of this debate, because and I kind of referenced it. I kind of opened the door to this by saying, if authorship were important, why wouldn't God make sure authorship was, verifiable? And why wouldn't Jesus write something? I still...
Actually, it's interesting. I'm forgetting which book it was that I saw this, but I did see somebody in ancient times in one of these things make a reference that Jesus did write something down. But I don't know. I would say that Jesus spent his 3-year ministry ministering. I don't think his duty was not to go be recording all of this stuff. His duty was basically to be discipling and to sharing messages with his disciples. And so even John in the book of John basically says at the very end, if they recorded everything, the books would be excessive. And so we can see that sort of thing. So let's listen to what he says.
Still don't understand why there would be a God who would come down and take human form and interact with people and teach them lessons and use guile and deception. And then,
see, he slips in there, guile and deception. Now let's look at the character of Jesus. If you try to tell me Jesus was using guile and deception, I think you're being deceitful. So
allow there to be accounts that don't match up and whose authorship can't be affirmed. As far as this, skip the part where Matt roasted me. That's hilarious, producer Dane. I actually played that at the very beginning. So if you want to hear my commentary on Matt's commentary in answer, his non-answer, then you can listen to that at the very beginning of this, because I actually skipped it on purpose because I already played it. I don't want to be repetitive to those of you who've been listening since the beginning. state my position on this has been for years that if we're not all deserving of the Damascus Road experience, then we're talking about a God who's going to play favorites. And
Oh, I think, sorry, we didn't hear the last half or so of that sentence. I think the internet connection dropped down a bit.
yeah, I just got a pop-up that said my internet connection is unstable. But I was just saying that, you know, if there was a God that didn't feel that we were all deserving of Damascus Road experience, then he's playing favorites, and I don't really care to know him. But I don't think it's relevant to this debate.
I have 3 agnostic relatives, and they're pretty interesting people because one of them's my brother, and the other are 2 sisters-in-law. And basically, what they all have is they basically have said in one way or another that they're agnostics, and they basically have also indicated that they really don't care or even want there to be a God. And so it's interesting. I always wonder how you get to that point where you really don't want there to be a God. And I can see it in some people. I might think, oh, maybe it's their lifestyle that's driving them away, but not in these 3 people. My brother is a really amazing dad. I can't figure out why he would do that, but I do think there's an element of pride that has seeped into all 3 of them. And this pride is actually what gets down there. That's why they say pride comes before the fall. This idea of pride is something that you got to be aware of. Just don't let that overtake you, because if pride suddenly takes over your fear of God, I mean, it takes a lot of pride to try to pretend that our Creator didn't create this beautiful planet. So anyway.
You got it. And thanks so much. Appreciate your super chats. Jesus is Lard and Dave Dallafiore, thanks, who said, super job, James, and Brian Stevens and James Rock. Thanks for that. I'll pay you guys back later for saying that. Sigifredo Sarabia, thanks for your super chat, who said, John, who is the author that added Mark 16:9 verses 9 through 19 when it doesn't exist in the original manuscript? What are the implications if a...
So here's what it is. So Mark ends at this passage that basically says, the angel tells the women, he is not here, he has risen. Okay, so that's one of the last passages in Mark that's not contested. Now, this portion that's written after it, even if you go into your Bible, you're going to see them say that this was later on added, but it really doesn't matter. Now people like Bart Ehrman have tried to craft a narrative that Mark is the first gospel written and everybody else embellished upon Mark by including this bigger narration of the empty tomb story. But the simple fact to that idea is, even if we go to the book of Mark and we look at what Mark did write, look at Mark 14:62, when Jesus basically told the Pharisees that you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds. They knew exactly what that meant. That was a reference to Daniel 7, and that's why they decided to crucify him. He claimed to be the Son of God. And so we've got a very clear reference right there. So the book of Mark is plenty fine. Now Matt also is going to talk about, I'll just let him talk here. I'll come back.
Spotted Jesus and Virgin Mary wasn't added, plus having Mark before Matthew in order. So I think those are meant to be 2 different hypotheticals.
I can say the jury's out on the ordering of Mark and Matthew. Some people think that Mark was written first because it's a much simpler text. It's a much shorter text. And then they think like he rushed that out and then Matthew came a little bit later. But some of the early church fathers have indicated Matthew came first. And of course, you can see the ordering in our Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so you could make a case for either of them being first. I think the jury's still out on that.
Namely, if Mark did come before Matthew, as well as the implications of...
Yeah, so John, that's what I'm basically saying. Mark could have been the first gospel and Matthew and Luke could have pulled from that. That's completely possible. Or it's possible that Matthew was written first according to the early church fathers, and that's why they ordered it that way. I haven't really come to a decision on which way that should go. So it doesn't really matter. So
I'll let you answer the first one on Mark 16. The end.
Obviously they're drawing off several theories there. At first, the implication. So if Mark was first, and the last 12 verses of Mark wasn't included, then you don't have an actual eyewitness account in the statement of record placing the disciples of Jesus to seeing Christ after the resurrection. All you have is someone that's saying he's not here anymore, which can be interpreted in the other way. So it would definitely challenge the
No, let's not. It says he's not here. He has risen. Okay, so that's what it says. And then the women left. Now, I've actually, in one of my other videos, I put together the empty tomb accounts, and I actually just wove them all together. People make a lot of hidden assumptions when they read these empty tomb accounts, because in one account, it might say that there were 2 angels. In another account, it just reports 1. It's not saying that there was only 1. There's never an only 1. It just says 1. Okay, so it's just the one that the author considered more important to report. You also have times in the Gospels when the women aren't named or the women aren't reported. We've got the names of Jesus's brothers, but we don't have the names of any of his sisters. And so we just see little things like that, that just the Gospels would highlight people they wanted to highlight. And John highlighted a lot on Mary Magdalene. And it appears that Mary Magdalene went to the empty tomb first, and then she went back and she reported it to the disciples. And then she probably went back again. And at that point, she was with another Mary. And so, and then, she saw Jesus, and then she and the other Mary saw Jesus on the way back. And so we've got these different reports. When you put them all together, you just get a little bit different of a narrative that still makes a lot of sense. And so this idea that you can't put the Gospels together and you can't reconcile is built in with laden assumptions, that freezing Mary Magdalene, for example, and saying she didn't go back and forth a little bit, that's completely possible that she went back and forth. Okay, so that's the bottom line.
The resurrection account as actually happening, because you have no statement of record for apostles, disciples actually seeing the risen account. Which would,
except of course we do have 1 Corinthians 15, which we know was written prior to Mark, and we also know that 1 Corinthians 15 basically says that Jesus appeared to everybody, and so we've got that. That in itself is enough. We don't even need the Gospels at this point.
Which would be horrible for our case that we're making, and then you had it added in, so then it goes to reliability. So you had an account, then you add it in, it kind of goes to this evolutionary development of doctrine, which may goes to Matt's position, is that there may have been this theological or this what became popular, hey, we have to promote this for the greater good, and let's add this stuff in there. So the ramifications in terms of reliability gets kind of thrown out the window. You can't say that the documents are reliable if you have this information, then you added it on. It looks like you're promoting your theological agenda, and now you're throwing in an account where you see the disciples. It seems like everything has been fudged, and then you can start questioning.
See, I disagree with him, because again, you guys have to think about the motivation of the early fathers. People who feared God are going to try to write as accurately as possible. In the book of Revelation, at the very end, it makes it very clear that nobody's to add anything on to the book, okay? Because the canon's closed essentially. So you're not supposed to add any information on. So that actually makes a better case for some of these passages that were added on. Were added on in an honest sense that this event occurred. We have eyewitnesses saying this event occurred, and let's record it. And that also relates to the situation where Jesus faced a person who had was an adulteress, and people were getting ready to stone her. This is a story that was later added in, but we have to make the assumption that, again, the church fathers who feared God wanted to make sure that they would do something consistent with what God would want, and it was actually an occurrence in that ancient times. And so that's pretty important. So what do we have? Inspiring Philosophy just did a great video addressing the supposed time discrepancies in the resurrection account. Great, I'll have to watch that.
How much other stuff was added?
Actually, I did a little poll on Twitter, and Inspiring Philosophy won the poll for the best Christian YouTube channel.
And then I can understand why Matt Dillahunty looks at this as stories and just, further evolutionary development of what they're promoting. So it's huge to reliability, to the falsification of an actual eyewitness resurrection account. I would say
I don't really like Jonathan's answer there. I just don't like it, because I feel like, again, these authors are trying to be truthful. You can look at a lot of the stuff that they put in here. Here you have Mark and Peter. Mark reported the fact that Peter denied Jesus, and you have Mark was a good friend of Peter's, but he wanted to tell the truth. Okay, the other disciples also. You have Luke traveling with Paul. You have Paul showing up at the feet and cursing out Christians. You've got a lot of different stuff that would be pretty embarrassing going on back then, especially things like Peter denying Jesus 3 times when Jesus considered Peter to be his his beloved. You also have Jesus' own half-brothers trying to stop his ministry. That's pretty embarrassing stuff, but it's true, and they wanted to report the truth. Okay. You also have Jesus referring to himself as, like, you say, I'm a drunk or something like that, or I drink too much wine or something. I forget how he put it. But he said something to that. Oh, I know what it was. He said something like, he's a drinker versus John the Baptist was not a drinker. And he compared himself that way. And it sounds like it's coming across a little bit in an embarrassing way. But again, the Gospels authors and the other authors like Paul and the epistles wanted to be as accurate in reporting as possible. And Paul did say that the words came to him through God. And I would imagine that the words of these Gospels also came through God.
You would have to put down your Bible and really consider if this is.
No, mine done yet. Let me be more clear on how I said that. I think that the Revelation basically says that we're not supposed to add to the Gospels. However, if events occurred during the Gospel period, like the woman who was the adulteress, if that kind of thing occurred and somebody felt called from God to add in that information, I feel that that was why the information was added in, because it's an event that did occur and had actual eyewitness support. So the reason why they chose the 4 Gospels over, say, the Gospel of Peter and that is because, number one, the Gospels were early, they were attested, there were eyewitnesses, the people in the Gospels and in the other books basically traveled with one another. And so we've got a lot of that kind of stuff going on of them putting together. And think to yourselves, what is the motivation for these people to make anything up anyway? Number one, they fear God. They would definitely not want to make something up when you have a fear of God in you. And number two, they were being murdered, crucified, tortured, everything, beheaded. I mean, this was not a glorious task that they were doing. It was glorious and they were glorifying Jesus, but it certainly was not easy.
Really truth anymore.
Yeah, I don't know.
I think as far as Mary, Mother Mary being with the brothers, Mother Mary did travel with the brothers to try to stop Jesus' ministry. I think Mother Mary might have been a little confused on exactly what Jesus' calling was to do. We have Mother Mary saying during the virgin accounts, the virgin birth accounts, Mother Mary saying things such as that she held these things in her. So she probably, I would be surprised if Mother Mary and Joseph made much mention of how special Jesus was to the other brothers and sisters, just because of the overwhelming content of that message, how that would have overwhelmed everybody. And so she probably was a little confused, wondering what Jesus' mission was. And then she hears these rumors that he's out, doing miracles and things like that. And she was probably thinking, geez, I got to see what's going on here. So she probably accompanied them. But we're told in other passages that the brothers were the ones primarily who had these doubts.
I know that I could possibly agree more. And the thing is that when you say, hey, the oldest.
But actually go to the books of James and Jude, if you go into the books, those are written by 2 of Jesus's half brothers. And James refers to Jesus he refers to himself as a servant of Christ. Okay, so he had seen the risen Christ as reported in 1 Corinthians 15. And then Jude refers to himself as the brother of James, who is also the brother of course, Jesus, the half brother. And so we've got lots of references in those books to these brothers.
Manuscripts and the ancient witnesses don't reference verses 9 through 20 from Mark 16. Is it possible that this is a later interpolation that is in there specifically to cover the gaps, as you point out? Because when the Gospel of Mark ends at verse 8, it's just, hey, the women left and they trembling and they said nothing to anyone. Now, see, what he's doing is he's freezing them in time. They said nothing to anyone. And you could add on the word initially. Okay. Then they went down to the thing. They saw the apostles. They basically told them. Peter and John went running back to the empty tomb once they heard from the women that Jesus was not in the empty tomb. And so they went down there. Then Mary also was returning back and forth. So when you freeze people in time and you pack it with assumptions, you're basically doing bad Bible interpretations. Already contradicts what's recorded in other Gospels. The Easter account is complete. We should have a completely separate debate on the multiple accounts of the Easter story and how there's no way to reasonably reconcile this. But what you get in verse...
No, there actually is a way to reasonably reconcile this. It's to take away your faulty assumptions that they were locked in time. Number one, they could only go to the tomb once. I mean, there's a lot of faulty assumptions that have to be dismantled before you do that. And so if you're going to say that Mary Magdalene could only go to the tomb once, that's not logical. So she went to the tomb initially. She saw that it was empty. She went back, reported it. Then she went back to the tomb and she met Jesus. Okay, so it's very easy to reconcile.
verses 9 through 20 is, hey, the women went, or in verse 8, women went away and didn't say anything to anybody. And then all of a sudden, verse 9, it's like, oh, he appeared to Mary Magdalene. And then they went and talked to people, and Jesus appeared in different forms. And then, Mary Magdalene went and told those who'd been with him, and then Jesus appeared to others. And then,
but you see, Kimomaki, life doesn't have to be parsimonious. Life usually has some complications. Like if I went to Publix, which is our grocery store near me, and I'm going to go there today. So if I go to the grocery store once and then I forget something, I go back to the grocery store. I mean, and then I recount today that I went to the grocery store. I'm probably not going to say, I'd say, yes, I went to the grocery store. Am I going to say I went to the grocery store 2 times? No, I'd just say I went to the grocery store Saturday. So there's little things like that you think in your own life aren't necessarily parsimonious.
when you get on to essentially the version of the Great Commission, go onto the world. You'll be able to pick up snakes without dying, or without, being, you can drink deadly poisons, all these things that aren't going to hurt you. And so we get snake handling church.
The question, why would Jesus deny his mother in that passage? It's not that he denied his mother. He basically just said anyone who believes in God is his mother or his brothers and sisters and that kind of thing. So anyone who's a God follower is basically correlated with Jesus. And that's also kind of a reference a little bit to Isaiah 53 when we talk about Jesus' offspring. In many cases where Jesus said, my sheep hear me, my sheep hear my voice, and they recognize it. See, I'm one of his sheep, and so are you guys. So if you guys are listening to this channel, it's maybe because maybe it's because you want to know the truth, and maybe you're interested in that. And maybe right now you're having doubts and you're an atheist. If you want to know the truth, ask God. He will provide. I promise you that. Promise. Absolutely.
Churches. And I would hope that any reasonable person today would look at, specifically verses 17 and 18 and say, that's not real. This is how guys have died repeatedly in snake handling churches in the United States, because they think that this is their commission and they need to show you. So meanwhile,
the people in snake handling churches are testing God. Jesus said not to put God to the test. I don't know why anybody would do something so loony. I also don't know why people were trying to hold church services a few weeks back under this pandemic. I mean, what are people thinking? Seriously, you're not supposed to test God. You don't put him in a situation like that. You don't go in there and say, I'm not going to get, no matter what, I'm not going to get contaminated, or I'm not going to contaminate anybody if I happen to have the problem, and go into this thing with a pandemic going on. So people need to be a little bit more responsible. These snake handlers are not doing a good thing.
They are being cruel to snakes by not feeding them, letting them waste away. I've had snakes before.
How many of you guys in the audience have had snakes before? I'm curious, because I would never own a snake. I can't even imagine having one of those things in my house where it could, slither out and get on my floor and hit my feet or my kids. I just can't even imagine that kind of thing. So I think it takes a certain level of daringness to have a snake. I would not want to ever do that. And so I'm just curious to know if any of you guys have snakes. Let's see. I don't know how quickly you'll see what I just said.
Snakes will live for a long time, and yet these snake handling church preachers have to keep going out and getting new snakes all the time because they just don't feed them, so they don't have the energy.
Now, I think the snake, I think saying that the church handlers, people who have snakes, would not feed the snakes, I think that is a bald assertion, because it would be kind of risky not feeding your snake. It's going to get really hungry. Then what is it going to do? It's going to get out and bite you.
Energy to bite, and they're not necessarily producing as much venom, but eventually they're going to make one of those snakes mad. They're going to get bit and die, and I can list off a handful that have done that. Why would any God or representative of God put something like that in there and do it as an addendum? Everything about
You can notice actually one of the things that did occur in the book of Acts. Number one, a couple things occurred in the book of Acts. One is 40 different Pharisees decided to take a vow that they were going to starve themselves until they killed Paul. I mean, can you imagine the pressure Paul was under? So that's one of the reasons why Paul left Jerusalem. He had 40 Pharisees taking a vow of starvation. And so Paul eventually, at one point, he was being shipped over to Rome, and his ship wrecked at one point, and he was on this dry land, and he got bitten by a snake, and it was a poisonous snake. And people were staring at him wondering, when is he going to start going down? He's just bitten by a poisonous snake. And Paul was able to recover from that snake bite sort of miraculously. I mean, a lot of the stuff that was going on in the New Testament, we've got a lot of miracles in there. We've got a lot of mentions of miracles. So let's keep going. 9
through 20 feels completely different from everything else at Mark. And that is an issue of credibility. However, for the purposes of this debate, we could throw out verses 9 through 20 and just say that everything up through verse 8 was still potentially written by Mark.
To me, this is like a non-issue, but I'm just, Ronan, I see different people like different pets. I agree with you. Definitely. I like dogs. And you know what I heard? I don't really like cats, but I actually heard this thing that said that atheists are more likely to have cats than non-atheists. I think that's really interesting. So I'm wondering why do you guys like cats? I think cats have no personality, and they're not happy to see you when you get home. They're just kind of like, I don't know why you want to have a cat.
On behalf of Peter.
Gosh.
I don't think the case has been made for that, but you could do it. But for 9 through 20, I don't know how you can make that case.
Thanks very much. And Brian Stevens, thanks for your super chat, who asked, why would a God of all of humanity have a particular chosen people? I think that's for you, Jonathan.
Well, I am Calvinistic in my theology for my Anglican background.
I want to answer that question because I think that's a good question. Why would God have a particular chosen people? Read C.S. Lewis and what he said about that in Mere Christianity. But also, basically, it's not that they're special so much as that they were chosen to convey the good news. They were chosen to receive the good news, and God singled them out in multiple ways. He singled them out by how they dressed. He singled them out by how they were supposed to wear their hair, by the fact they weren't supposed to have tattoos, and by how they ate. So he wanted to distinguish them from all of these other people. And of course, his whole moral set of laws that he gave them in the 10 Commandments, they were completely distinct from other people. And through the diet, that was one of the things I've talked to some of my Jewish friends. Through their diet, because their diet was different, a lot of times that would discourage them from eating with other people who didn't have the same dietary restrictions against, say, pork or something like that. But what's interesting is that as soon as Jesus ushered in the new covenant, many of these restrictions were lifted. It says that in Acts 10. Basically, now you can eat whatever foods you want to eat. Anything that God makes is clean. Okay, and so these other restrictions, the hairstyles, no tattoos, all that kind of stuff is gone. So we don't have that kind of thing with the new covenant because God no longer needs to distinguish Jewish people. The word went out to all of the Gentiles too, and now the word is opened up to the whole world. And if you're saying, well, geez, why? What about all of the people who lived prior to Jesus? Well, consider the fact that the Population Reference Bureau has figured out that we have had 108 billion people on this planet, and 57% of them have lived in the last couple of thousand years since year one. Okay, 57%, and that's only going to increase. So it's interesting.
Once again, it doesn't really relate to the current topic. Just from my perspective or theological background, just like a king, a God can do what he wants, whether we want to look at the morality or, of that. It's, a king can do what he wants. I don't want to go into a big theological discussion on the sovereignty of God and, God's ability to choose who he wants. Looking at the overall greater purpose.
The Calvinist view is basically that people have been pre-chosen. So prior to the arrival on the earth, God has already known exactly which people are going to be written in the Lamb's Book of God. So according to Calvinists, I believe, if I'm interpreting them right, I don't think they can do really anything that would shake up that decision by God. And so and that's the Calvinist position. Now the Molinist, that's like I am. Molinist has a position that God knows what we will, would, and could do under varying circumstances. And I think the Bible has a lot of support for Molinism. But anyway, here we go.
Purpose he has with creation in teaching his people and leading them through these times. But that's all I would say. Otherwise, I think we can go on for hours into this particular topic, not related to the author, but definitely a good question on the sovereignty of God.
You got it. I'll try to keep the questions more restrained, be more choosy. We do have, let's see, Stupid Horror Energy, thanks for your question. She said, did Irenaeus really argue that there are 4 gospels that can't be read independently because there are, quote, 4 corners of the earth, unquote?
I guess, Irenaeus is making an argument. Numerology was very big in the ancient world, and he was using those legal arguments to try to explain why there are only 4 gospels. And I think he was trying to do as best as he could. Question is, why was there only 4? That's all that was received. That was all that was handed on. And, you know, he's trying best in those legal means, but what he does.
I think I see a good point with Isaiah Braxton here. He says, Jesus calling Peter Satan. Yes, that's a terribly embarrassing moment. And actually, there's even more than that. Think about this. If they're trying to craft this story together, and this is a key point, look at what happened at the crucifixion. You've got the women there. Okay, the women are witnessing Jesus' crucifixion, and the Apostle John. The Apostle John was also the only one who was brave enough really to go witness Jesus' trial and not to deny Jesus 3 times. So you've got Peter is super embarrassing position. Here's the guy who's supposed to be the rock. Jesus said he was going to build the church on that rock, Peter. And where is Peter to be found when Jesus is crucified? He's nowhere to be found. He's nowhere to be found. He was hiding out with the other disciples. I mean, that's very embarrassing stuff. And the other embarrassing thing is, why didn't the men go to the empty tomb first? Why did the women go there? The women went there to clean Jesus, essentially, to bring more oils and do things like that. That was their purpose on the 3rd day. They witnessed they were all around the whole time with Joseph of Arimathea. So we've got all this kind of stuff going on, and the men just hiding out. So it's kind of a complete embarrassment when you think about that, but you can't just make stuff up. So they didn't want to, the gospel authors wanted to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, even with all of the warts and other information that are in them. Hi, everybody. Slam RN. I just took away everybody's wrenches to simplify things. So I hope any of you who are in here, I got a lot of you who I've had wrenches on before, if you hadn't heard my explanation for that. But yesterday was a little bit of back and forth between a few people, and a couple people actually. And so I decided I would just go ahead and de-wrench everybody and start brand new. So at some point I'll add back some wrenches, but I think right now I'm just gonna take a little break from the wrench giving out because people were timing each other out, and I found people in the blocked group and on my channel. So I just thought maybe some power needs to be redistributed, and so now everybody's equal. So okay, so here we go.
Does demonstrate, or what he's trying to convey in his arguments in against heresies, is we have these churches. These are the 4 that have come down through the church history, and these are the names that are identified with them, and we can trace that back to the apostles. And when we look at the independent churches throughout, this testimony is corroborated with churches that don't necessarily agree with us, but we're all coming up with the same testimony. But I know Matt was talking about the Irenaeus's numerology, so I don't know if you want to give your thoughts on that, Matt.
I mean, you can view it as numerology. My view from when I was a Southern Baptist is that the Bible, that God was opposed to things like numerology, despite the fact that numbers are significant and God uses it throughout the.
That's funny because I'm a Baptist, Southern Baptist, and I actually don't think, I don't have a problem with all of the symbolism that's in the Bible. We've got a lot of things like the 12 tribes of Israel, and then we've got Jesus had 12 apostles. We've got the 40 days, as I mentioned, and 40 years throughout. We've got 3 days and 3 night idioms a couple of times. So we've got a lot of different interesting numbers represented in there. And as far as John V says, honest question, are you okay with transphobic jokes? I don't really like making fun of people. If it's something that could hurt somebody's feelings, I think it's just better left unsaid. I think that's the bottom line as far as that. So I know some people like to do that kind of stuff, but sometimes it ends up being hurtful. And so I try to avoid that.
The Bible and stuff. I just find that response to this thing on Irenaeus, it would be one thing to say, Irenaeus never said this, in which case I have no evidence other than I've been told and it's written and I could go look at it and I have a good authority that he actually said this.
No. Is this the ultimate irony? I wanted to get to this part. Is this the ultimate irony or what? Now, he just said that we don't have enough support for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, even though, you guys, if you just joined, you missed some stuff, even though Jonathan named Irenaeus, Tertullian, Gaius, Eusebius, Papias, John the Apostle, Polycarp, Ignatius, Clement, Paul, Augustine, Jerome. he mentioned multiple churches, different geographies that have all attributed to, I mean, they've all, in different ways, but when you put them together, you've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the named authors. There's no ancient other authors, but he's willing here, Matt is willing to take Irenaeus's word. Is this a little bit ironic? Okay, he's willing to do that, but he's not willing to say that all of these people who attributed the Gospels to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are legit.
But you say that Irenaeus went with the 4 because that's all there was that was agreed upon by the churches. But that's not what he says at all. He doesn't say, and it would be very easy for a church father to say, hey, we've scoured the churches and there is agreement on these 4 and only these 4, and that is the reason that we can be assured that God has preserved these 4 gospels from amongst the frauds, from amongst the heretics, and spread it to the churches. He could have said something like that, but instead he talks about the 4 quarters of the earth, the 4 universal winds, the church.
And that's not neither here nor there. That's not really a big deal. So Irenaeus basically was looking at the number 4 and thinking it's special. So what? So that doesn't really matter. And so why did I not remove I didn't want, here's what happened, John, is I've noticed over the past couple of months some fighting going on in my chats, and I just thought if I just make everybody equal, then I can avoid complaints that people are being knocked out of the chat or put into the block room or something like that. So I'll just kind of monitor it myself for a little while, and then eventually I'll be adding back some wrenches. So I do appreciate everybody coming. I appreciate all of you. I did get in a little little battle with Brian Stevens yesterday on this channel, actually watching this last night. So I was watching this debate last night, and Brian Stevens kept tagging me and trying to, it's just like, this is just going a little bit too far. So I just decided to de-wrench all.
Churches scattered around the world, the pillar of the ground, the church is the gospel and the spirit of life. He goes into all this kind of flowery sophistry and look at the significance of 4. I'm surprised he didn't say, look, there were 12 disciples, and if we take a look at the Trinity, we can divide them into 3. That's 3 groups of 4, and that's why we need 4 gospels. I mean, you could do numerology stuff like that, although perhaps Irenaeus couldn't do that because the concept of the Trinity didn't exist at the time of Irenaeus.
So I want to speak to that right there. Okay, so we know, if you go back to the book of Genesis, we know that God refers to let us make this creation. And we know that isn't, we basically know that means that there's a presence, that there's that he is more than just one. He's more than a single one. So he is basically 3 beings in one essence. And so the way that St. Patrick got everybody to really understand that is he had the concept of the Clover in Ireland, or the Shamrock. So one of the things that we can also say that with the Trinity is we say that Jesus also spoke of the Father, and he's the Son, and then he spoke of the Holy Spirit when he said the Holy Spirit was going to come back and he had to leave. He told the apostles in the book of Acts, so the Holy Spirit can come in. So we already know that there's definitely 3 holy concepts. And so that's this idea.
But we're not going to go into, I guess, the Jonah and comma and other things that are problematic about the modern version of the Bible compared to early ones.
It could definitely be another conversation, which would make for definitely good discussion on.
Gotcha. And Garrett Brown, thanks for your super chat, who asked, can Matt talk about why eyewitness testimony is unreliable? And would John require the same standards of evidence for God that he would for Zeus or Poseidon if they also have alleged eyewitnesses?
Yeah, so I could give a whole lecture and have a whole other discussion on the reliability of eyewitness testimony, but I would just recommend that you go Google reliability of eyewitness testimony. This is something that's been studied in detail about.
This is almost one of the most amusing arguments against God, as far as I can see. So eyewitnesses, if you go to any courtroom, who do you think are sitting in the courtroom? Eyewitnesses, okay? People who are called to testify are eyewitnesses. Eyewitness testimony is, of course, valid. Now, one of the things that J. Warner Wallace noticed when he put together the eyewitness testimonies and the testimonies of the people in the back is he realized that the fact that they were a little bit different from each other, these different accounts, actually leads credence to their reliability, because if they were all exactly the same, he thought they would be very suspicious, because in real life, that's not what you get. When he is a former detective, and he talked about the investigations that he did, and he said each time a different witness would come together with a little bit different of a story, and that actually leads credence to the story. Okay, so that's something that's there.
About the reliability of what people are claiming, including in short time frames. There's a limit to what a human being can retain and retain accurately. And what our brains do is best, this is probably the best way I can describe it, is we experience a bunch of stuff and then our brain puts it together in a way that makes sense to us, which
it actually does do something like that. So that's the Kolb model of learning. David Kolb, K-O-L-B, is the name of the person who originated that model. This idea is you come in, you experience something, you have a concrete experience, you reflect upon it, and you basically, as you're reflecting on it, you're matching it up to prior experiences and building knowledge on that experience. And so you're doing this, and like this neural network is increasing. One of the things with the language studies, and I mean, sorry, the brain studies that they've done lately, is people used to think that you start losing they used to think you start losing knowledge and that sort of thing over the years, even prior to going and being seen now when you're older. But people used to think that sort of thing, that you couldn't really gain knowledge after a certain age. But you actually, every time you learn something new, your brain is connecting different neurons and putting it all together in this neural network, which grows over time. So the more learning you do, the better off you are. The more you read, the better off you are. In fact, I recommend reading at least a book a week, if you're out of school, you can do that, you have the time. When he accepts no. Yeah, Slam, you're being pretty funny.
Which is why I've lost bets with friends of mine on the name of a particular brand of mustard. I was so absolutely confident that this mustard.
And see, mustard really isn't important. And that's one of the reasons why that's not retained. How many of you even remember what you ate last Saturday? I have no idea what I ate last Saturday. I'd have to really, really think about it, because it's just a mundane event. Mundane events aren't the kind of events people recall. But if you were traveling around with the Son of Man, okay, for 3 years, and you experienced the empty tomb, and you experienced the resurrection, and you were with him over 40 days, boy, I bet you're able to put that together just as well as somebody today could probably put together where they were when John F. Kennedy was shot. Okay, years and years ago that occurred, 1960 something, 63 or something like that, or whenever that was. Or Martin Luther King, you've got him being shot in 1968. I'll bet you, if you were around at that time and you were old enough to remember this, you probably know exactly where you were when Martin Luther King was shot. Okay, I bet you all knew where you were, since all of you probably watching this are at least maybe 20 years old or maybe 30 years old. But I bet you those of you who were at a reasonable age in 2001 during 9/11, I'll bet you know exactly where you were, because significant events tend to be retained very well. Okay, significant events tend to be retained very well. And of course, if you had the luxury of traveling around with Jesus, that would be pretty significant time period.
Brand was spelled this way instead of this way. We fear a lack of confidence. And so we lie to ourselves and boost a sense of confidence. And if you were like, just all you have to do to demonstrate this is go back, and I've read it twice. What was Irenaeus referencing for why there were 4 gospels? How accurate can you get that to what I said, and how accurate is that to what Irenaeus said? I apart from recommending you do some research on the reliable eyewitness testimony, this is not remotely controversial. There's a reason why.
I'll bet you in the chat. I got you in the chat. New York City, Fenyer, actually where you were, if you were up there during that, and maybe if you're a firefighter who was actually in 9/11 protecting people, I'll bet you remember that pretty well. Okay, I just would imagine that. I remember my wedding day very well, even though it was 2003. That's a long time ago, but I remember my wedding day, and I remember these other significant events. I remember, my son's being born. I've got specific memories in the hospital room of the people who visited me and what we talked about. I remember that kind of stuff because it was a very significant time. So you do remember some of the things in certain parts of your lives that are very important. So here we go.
We expect testimonial accounts to be backed up with evidence before we make big decisions. There are some things where testimonial account is going to be fine. If you tell me I just got a new puppy, I'm just going to believe you.
Okay, so I wanted to add on one other thing. I remember the 5 car crashes I was in. Do you believe me? I had 5 car crashes. Yes, guess what? And they all happened before I turned 23. Okay, so I had totaled 2 cars. I walked away from totaling 2 cars and 3 other car accidents without a scratch. Okay, so how does something like that happen? I just get really amazingly lucky, and I do for that. One of those reasons is I pray to God, and I feel like I've been incredibly lucky. I would never run the risk and do something that's risky at this point in my life. I would never, like, for example, jump off a plane. You're not going to find me on a hang glider. You're not going to find me doing risky things. I don't even ski down black diamond ski slopes anymore because I don't have the body to take that kind of risk anymore. I have to go down the blues or the greens. So anyway, the bottom line that I'm just trying to make right here is that you do probably remember very significant events in your life pretty well. I do remember somebody attacking me too in my car, and I was able to get away. And I specifically remember that event, even what the guy was wearing, and that he got into a silver Porsche and drove away. And I found out later who he was. But anyway, and actually, what's interesting about that, I found out later who that guy was. He had this name, David Miller, and David Miller is the name of the pastor who I had a chance encounter with on a plane, who recommended that I read Mere Christianity. So here I've got the worst person in the world and one of the best people in the world together. So that's pretty incredible stuff. Talk about eerie. It's a little bit eerie. So anyway, I think I'm going to go ahead and end the chat. I want to say thank you, everybody, for coming in today. Please like and subscribe if you haven't done that yet. I will eventually be putting wrenches back in here, but I just kind of wanted to start fresh. That's all. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the chat, and you guys go and have a great Saturday or Sunday, whatever it is where you are. So we will see you later.